Welcome back to Bunny Call. Today we are reading the final story, which is called The Man in Room 1280, which is already a very interesting name, and so I'm really curious to see where this goes. Apparently, this one is really lore heavy, so, we'll see just what happens. Standing at the smudged window in room 1280, the nurses deliberately kept their backs to their patient and watched the priest approach the hospital. They all breathed as shallowly as they could, trying to ignore the sensation of being observed and judged. "He has to be warned," one of the nurses says. "He won't believe us," the second one said. The head nurse's face was as hard as stone. "Then he'll find out the hard way." Arthur pedaled his vintage bicycle, Ruby, through the stone archway at the base of the drive leading up to Heracles Hospital. The archway, like much of the hospital itself, was engulfed in thick green ivy. The bicycle's antique balloon tires chuffed the moist pavement, spitting fallen leaves in their wake. A black SUV passed Arthur, and the little boy in the back seat turned to stare, watching Arthur until the SUV mounted the drive's curve for the columned entrance of the imposing medical center. Arthur knew that he and Ruby made a striking picture. Arthur didn't have to wear the long, flowing black cassock that fluttered out behind Ruby, but he liked wearing it. It buoyed him, made him feel like he was being lifted by angels' wings. Or maybe he just thought it looks good, in which case he needed to do better with the first deadly sin. Ruby was evident of that as well. A priest didn't need a fully restored 1953 bicycle with gleaming chrome fenders and shiny red paint, but a priest could enjoy what he had, couldn't he? Ruby was a gift from a dying man. How could Arthur refuse to accept her? Arthur smiled to himself. The truth was that neither his nor Ruby's appearance interested him much. He was really just a meek man who allowed himself a couple of indulgent flares because they made him happy. A few drops of rain hit Arthur's face, making him regret leaving his felt Saturno hat, sized large enough to fit over his red bicycle helmet, at home. "It's gonna rain," Arthur's housekeeper Peggy had warned him. "The sun loiters behind every cloud, Peggy," he told her. "It just needs a little faith to coax it out." Peggy had laughed at him, as she often did. Arthur glanced up at the roiling steel-gray sky. Layered behind the gray were inky wisps of cirrus clouds that curled like beckoning fingers. Arthur put his head down and pedaled faster. Just another couple 100 feet and he'd be under the hospital's portico, sheltered beneath the dubious protection of the stone Cerberus statue that hunched atop the columns at the hospital's entrance. Heracles Hospital was one of the most imposing hospitals to which Arthur had been called. The structure had been built centuries before using rough-hewn stone painstakingly extracted from the local quarry at the cost of countless men's life. And it held generations of pain, struggle, and sorrow within its walls. But Arthur knew it also held hope and love and joy. That was always what he chose to see. When he looked up from the road, Arthur's gaze was drawn to the sky above the hospital. He smiled. One streaming golden ray of sunshine touched the back side of the red roof tile, spearing the blackness and slicing through the gray clouds pressing down on the building. "See," said Faith. Ruby didn't respond, but Arthur had to laugh at himself when, just as he pulled up to the bike rack under the portico, rain began to fall in heavy drops. They splattered the pavement and filled the air with a sweet ozone smell. "Well, rain is good too," he said, as he flipped up the hem of his cassock and got off Ruby's cushy leather seat. "Excuse me, Father, were you talking to me?" someone said. Arthur turned around to find a young woman in a rain slicker, her blonde hair pulled into a taut ponytail, juggling a pink backpack, an orange tote bag, and a red umbrella. She had a square face and a wide mouth that were spared from looking masculine by her lively blue eyes and the bright makeup she wore. She smiled at Arthur tentatively. "Hello, young lady," Arthur said. He gave her a half bow. Arthur had just turned 47 the previous spring, but he looked older because his hair had mostly turned gray a decade before, and deep emotions had carved lines on his face. Recently, he decided he was now old enough to refer to younger women as young lady. When he was a young man himself, he was always befuddled by what to call women. Miss and ma'am seemed to offend more often than not, for reasons that confused Arthur. "Hey, you" was always inappropriate. "Hi," the young woman said. Arthur held out a hand. "I'm Father Blythe." Inwardly, he cringed at the formality. He preferred being called by his first name, but his bishop had made it abundantly clear that only so many of Arthur's idiosyncrasies would be tolerated. "I'm Mia," the young woman said. She shook Arthur's hand. Mia's hand was small, soft, and very, very cold. Arthur had it slightly longer than he should have, willing some of the warmth into the chill of her fingertips. "Mia Fremont," Mia said when Arthur released her hand. "I'm a nurse here, or I'm going to be, or I mean I am. Well, as of 15 minutes from now I am, I guess, or I am because I was already hired?" Mia's voice was mellow and sweet and filled with endearing uncertainty. Arthur smiled. "Congratulations," he said. He looked at Mia more closely and saw that a dark blue nurse's uniform was hiding under her yellow rain slicker. Thanks?" Mia looked at the hospital's entrance and frowned. Her lower lip quivered for just a second. Arthur pulled a bicycle chain and lock from the satchel he wore slung across his body. He bent over to secure Ruby. He was all for faith, but prudence had a place in the world, too. A car pulled in under the portico and let out a large woman barking orders at a smaller woman, who followed her into the hospital. An older couple walked slowly toward the entrance, hand in hand. A janitor sat on a nearby bench, staring at his feet. 2 fat pigeons hopped along the walkway, pecking at invisible morsels. The rain was coming down harder now. It thrummed on the pavement and hissed under the tires of passing cars. A metallic trickling sound came from the downspouts at the bottom edge of the hospital's columns. Arthur straightened and realized Mia was still standing next to him. She stared at the hospital entrance. "Are you okay, Mia?" Arthur asked. Mia blinked. "What? Me? Sure, I mean, I will be, I hope. Well, yes, I'm better than I was. She stopped talking and turned. "Why is the dog that guards Hades up there?" She pointed at the portico's ceiling. Arthur frowned. He wasn't sure of it himself. In Greek mythology, Cerberus was tasked with preventing the dead from leaving the underworld. Arthur didn't know whether the Cerberus statue was meant to suggest it was going to keep the dead from entering the hospital, or whether it was going to keep the people who died in the hospital from moving on. The symbolism was made even murkier by the hospital's name. Heracles, the son of Zeus and Alcmene, was a mythological hero. One of his 12 labors was capturing Cerberus. The hospital's name and statuary left Arthur wondering if he was in a place of good or evil. Either way, he had a job to do. "I'm not exactly sure," Arthur said, "but it's just a statue." Mia didn't seem convinced. Arthur glanced at his black-banded watch. "Shall we?" He indicated the hospital's automatic sliding doors, which had swished open and closed at least a dozen times since Arthur had locked up Ruby. Mia lifted her chin. "Yes, I guess I have to." She glanced at her own watch. "I made sure to get here early, and I'm going to be late if I don't go in now." Arthur took a step, but Mia didn't. Arthur stopped. He wanted to get on with why he was here, but Mia seemed to need help, and helping was what Arthur did. "Do I perceive a hesitation?" Arthur asked. Mia sighed. "This job wasn't my first choice. I wanted the position at Glendale, you know." Arthur nodded. He visited Glendale Hospital often, and he had to admit that he preferred it as well. He'd only visited Heracles the one time so far, just the previous week, and he already knew this wasn't going to be his favorite place. But Arthur couldn't be choosy. He was called to where he was called. "Heracles is actually far more modern than Glendale," Arthur offered as encouragement. 10 years before, Heracles had been bought by a billionaire, who had practically gutted the old hospital before renovating it into a state-of-the-art medical center. The renovation made sure to keep all the original exterior architectural details, and even the hospital's interior was designed to be reminiscent of an older era, with crisp white walls, black and white tiled floors, thick baseboards, and crown moldings. The result was a sort of time whiplash, where cutting-edge technology shared space with crystal chandeliers and wrought iron scrollwork. "I know," Mia said, "but—" She sighed again. "I guess it's better than the prison hospital. That's where I was before." Arthur was surprised. "Really? I never saw you there." "You go out to the prison?" "I go where I'm needed," Arthur said. A siren screamed, squawked, and then burbled into abrupt silence as an ambulance rocked to a stop in front of the hospital's emergency entrance, 50 feet from where Arthur and Mia stood. "Shall we go inside?" Arthur suggested. He put his hand lightly on Mia's upper back in an attempt to propel her forward. It didn't work. Mia grabbed the sleeve of Arthur's cassock. "What do you mean you go where you're needed?" Arthur stepped back to avoid two teenage girls carrying a bouquet of balloons that looked big enough to pick them up and carry them away. He motioned for Mia to join him next to a cluster of panicle hydrangeas, the plant's large, white cylindrical flowers hanging on valiantly, even though the early fall's chill pressed upon them. Once tucked out of the way, Arthur faced Mia. "I give the dying their last rites." Mia shivered. "But you seem so cheerful, so kind. How can you be that way around death?" Arthur smiled. Death isn't a sad thing, it's a transition, and I'm kind of like a tour guide for people making the transition. Or maybe more like a traveling companion. Instead of letting fear take people away, I step in and take fear's place. Once fear is gone, the soul can reach the other side in peace. Mia gazed into Arthur's eyes, and he wondered what she saw there. He perceived his eyes to be the boring brown eyes of a simple man, but what did others see? Arthur waited, sure he was still needed here more than he was needed in the hospice wing that summoned him, at least for another moment. Finally, Mia took a deep breath and nodded. "I'm glad I met you, Father." "Me too, Mia." He held up his arm, elbow out. "Well, could you escort me to my first day on the job, then? I've been assigned to the hospice wing, and I bet that's where you're going." Arthur smiled and took Mia's arm. "Indeed I am, Mia. Let's go." At the curved desk at the nurse's station in the hospice wing, Arthur passed Mia off to a tall, sharp-edged woman with too many teeth and a dark-eyed gaze that unsettled Arthur. Nurse Ackerman was the head of the hospice wing, and Arthur had met her last week when he came to introduce himself. He'd admonished himself for disliking her immediately, although, to be fair, he doubted many human beings did like her. He said a silent prayer for Mia, and for Nurse Ackerman, then he followed the nurse's rigid, bony back down the wide hall. As they passed open doorways, Arthur occasionally glanced into rooms where he felt moved to do so. Some rooms felt heavy and somber, and Arthur said a prayer for the patients and families in them. Some rooms felt ebullient, some even effervescent. The people in those rooms didn't need Arthur's help. They understood the truth of the journey ahead. He prayed for them anyway. You could never have too much support. Nurse Ackerman led Arthur past room after room, so far down the long hall that he wondered if they'd somehow passed through an invisible barrier into another hospital. The longer they walked, the denser the air felt. The worse it smelled, too. Arthur was used to the hospital smells of bitter medicine, sharp urine, fetid waste, and pungent antiseptics. But this was something else, something acrid and ancient. "The patient you're about to see," Nurse Ackerman said, "is a special case." Arthur almost jumped out of his skin when Nurse Ackerman opened her mouth. He was already surprised by her escort down the hall. He hadn't expected her to speak, too. She'd barely spoken to him the last time he was here, and then only to give him a room number and send him on his way. Her voice was as sharp as her appearance, and it held a disturbing sibilance that made the hairs stand up on the back of Arthur's neck. Every consonant sounded like it was being spit on and then stabbed with a forked tongue. She continued, "The man has been on life support for many years." "How many years?" Arthur asked. Nurse Ackerman's shoulder blades rose in annoyance. "Irrelevant," she snapped. "He's been here all this time?" Nurse Ackerman ignored Arthur. "When the state finally took him off life support." "Why'd the state do that? Where's his family?" Nurse Ackerman whirled around and impaled Arthur with a searing look. "He has no family," she nearly shouted. Her tone suggested Arthur should have known that somehow. Yes, he'd done a little research on this place, talked to a couple colleagues, but he hadn't heard of any special case. Nurse Ackerman rubbed at the large mole under her left eye. She took a breath, turned away from Arthur, and resumed walking. Arthur glanced back over his shoulder to be sure he was still in Heracles Hospital and would be able to find his way back to Ruby. At the moment, his bicycle seemed impossibly far away. "As I was saying, the state took him off of life support," Nurse Ackerman continued with the air of someone long suffering. "Even so, he wouldn't die." "A miracle," Arthur said, with a quick prayer of thanks. "Hardly." The word sounded like a shot, reverberating off the stark white walls and closed doors around them. Closed doors. Arthur looked at the old-fashioned, wide, six-panel dark wood doors with frosted glass windows. All the doors were closed on this end of the hall, and none of the panels revealed light from within the rooms. Why? Arthur opened his mouth to ask, then thought better of it and remained silent. Nurse Ackerman stopped before a door that looked strangely darker than all the other doors they had passed, but the glass panel indicated the room's light was on. He glanced up to check the overhead lights. Was one of them out? Before he could confirm his suspicion, Nurse Ackerman pushed the door open. "He's in here," she said unnecessarily. Arthur glanced at the number by the door. 1280. As soon as the door was open, the smell Arthur had noticed was obvious. It came from whatever lay in the hospital bed on the other side of the room. Up close, the smell was even more noxious, and it was more easily discerned. It was a smoky smell, but not like any smoky smell Arthur had ever encountered. It was like smelling burnt meat, smoldering plastic, and molten steel all at once. Arthur picked out the disturbing odors of carbon and sulfur. What was in this room? Arthur didn't have long to ponder the question because Nurse Ackerman stepped aside and made a sweeping hand gesture at the bed in front of her. She reminded Arthur of those women on game shows, the ones who elaborately indicated potential prizes. Lying there was the man Arthur had come to see. Arthur stopped breathing. He clutched the door jamb. He ordered his legs to keep holding him up. This patient could not be called a prize, except perhaps in hell. Arthur had seen a lot of horrible things in his tenure as priest. He'd been to car crashes and airplane crashes and all manner of natural disasters. He'd prayed over people missing limbs, missing eyes, missing large chunks of their bodies. He'd seen so much disfigurement and physical horror that he would have, until this moment, been fairly confident in saying he'd seen every misery that could be thrust upon the human body. But this... It wasn't the appearance of the man alone that took Arthur's breath away. It was... What? Not the smell, the incongruity, the impossibility. Arthur's brain begged for oxygen, and he remembered to inhale. Sucking in a lungful of rancid, decay-tinged air, Arthur swiped at the tears that suddenly filled his eyes. They weren't emotional tears. His eyes were reacting to a puzzling acidity in the room. Arthur worked his tongue around in his mouth, gathering up enough saliva to speak. He looked at Nurse Ackerman, and noticed her eyes were squinted and her nose was more pinched than usual. "What's his name?" Arthur asked. "We don't know. No family has claimed him. He has no records." "Well, what about fingerprints?" Arthur asked, and then immediately realized what a stupid question it was. Nurse Ackerman let out a gurgling snort that Arthur supposedly passed for a laugh. "A DNA sample was taken, but it matches no individual in existing DNA databases," she said. Arthur nodded. "As you can see," Nurse Ackerman continued, "he has brain function." She gestured at a monitor, upon which a series of jagged green lines played out across a dark screen. "That's a REM sleep pattern." Arthur stared. He'd take her word for it, as the tall, spiky lines meant nothing to him. According to Dr. Henner, the hospital's sleep expert, that particular REM pattern indicates nightmares. Horrific nightmares. Arthur's gaze, which had been locked on the man in the bed, whipped to Nurse Ackerman. Was there just a little too much glee in the tone she used for horrific nightmares? Yes. Her mouth twitched at the corner as if she wanted to smile. Arthur frowned, and she raised an eyebrow at him. An overhead speaker right outside the door of room 1280 blasted out, "Nurse Ackerman, please come to room 907. "I'll leave you to it," she said, "but I'll be back. There's more for us to discuss." They were discussing? Arthur didn't feel like he was discussing anything. All he was doing was trying to accept what his senses were telling him. He was also trying to remember his training, his humanity, and his decency. Nurse Ackerman's footsteps slapped the floor as she retreated down the hall. Arthur didn't let go of the door jamb. He knew he needed to. He had to enter the room. But not yet. First he wanted to see if he could get his brain to understand the facts his eyes reported as being real. A disconnect had to be bridged before he could step into the situation and do something. Anything. Besides whimper like a small child. The man... Really? Could Arthur truly call this a man? Wasn't it more a corpse than a man? Well, no, some of the facts weren't consistent with the designation of a corpse. The REM monitor, for example. Fact 1, the man appeared to be burnt to a crisp. What lay in the bed in room 1280 resembled a human being only vaguely, in that it had the requisite shape. It had a head, a torso, 2 arms, and 2 legs. There, the similarity to humans ended. Fact 2. The burning had been so pervasive, so complete, that the only thing remaining was essentially a charred skeleton. Almost. Actually, Arthur wished the man was just a charred skeleton. If he were simply blackened human bones, he'd have been easier to look at. But the ruinous fire damage could be seen throughout the body. Although he had no hair, the man did have skin, or was it skin? Arthur had never seen anything like the dermis on this man. It looked like fire had scorched away so many layers that his skin was just an ashy covering, far too translucent for comfort. Arthur guessed the fire had siphoned all moisture from the body's covering, leaving it with extensive cracks, like the surface of a dried-up lake bed. Through those cracks, Arthur caught unwelcome glimpses of uncharred tissue. Fact 3. The man's organs worked, at least the ones Arthur could see. And that, in fact, was repellent in ways Arthur had never experienced before. Through the translucent skin and cracks, Arthur could literally watch the man's desiccated and blackened heart pumping. He could see the heat-shriveled lungs expanding and contracting. He could glimpse the seared kidneys and a bladder so carbonized it seemed like it was about to collapse in on itself. Fact 4. The man had no face. A hole in his skull indicated where his nose was supposed to be. Dark, cavernous pits lacking eyes looked at nothing. A toothless mouth gaped without lips to protect it. Fact 5. The man did have a brain. The REM pattern suggested this, and unfortunately, Arthur could see bits of gray matter between the cracks in the man's burned cranium. Fact 6. The man had blood flowing in his veins. What looked like scorched worms creeped around and through toasted tissues, pulsing under the skin and around the crisp skeleton. Arthur assumed these were veins. The blood on the sheets seemed to confirm it. Fact 7, and this was the most disturbing fact of all. It was the culmination of the other facts. It was the fact that Arthur couldn't fit into his understanding of the world, his understanding of the universe, his understanding of the power that governed everything. This was the fact that this man was alive against all odds. What was he? Arthur returned to his original question. Was this patient a man? Again, brain function would suggest he was, but what truly determined humanity and life? The soul. Did this gruesome collection of bloody, incinerated human remains have a soul? Peeling his fingers from the door jamb and rubbing them to put life back into them, he took a hesitant step forward. Arthur could hear the suck and rush of his respiration, even over the sound of the monitor's rhythmic beeps, and the wheeze and the click of the man's implausible breathing. Stopping, Arthur looked around the room for the first time since Nurse Ackerman had opened the door. There wasn't much to see. The room was white-walled, like every other room in Heracles Hospital. The man's bed sat in the middle of the room, surrounded by monitors. On one side of the bed, an IV pole held one pouch of, what, fluids? Nutrients? Did this man need either? An IV line ran into a port, taped to the man's radius, or his ulna. Arthur couldn't tell from where he stood. Even though he wasn't on life support, the man did have electrical leads affixed to his head and to his heart. It was surreal to see this life-affirming equipment attached to what looked like something in a morgue. The man even had a pulse ox monitor on his left index finger bone. How was that working? Pushed off to one side of the bed, a high-backed, padded vinyl visitor's chair was next to an empty rolling tray. The chair was positioned so its user could see out the narrow window that overlooked Heracles Hospital's parking lot. The wall opposite the window held a whiteboard. In other rooms, you might see medication schedules written there, but this one was clean. Next to the whiteboard, an LED X-ray viewer hung on the wall. When Arthur stepped over to the window, he looked out and saw the long driveway he and Ruby had pedaled up just 20 minutes before. Why did it seem like that had happened in another reality? Maybe in another lifetime? Standing by the window, Arthur suddenly felt an icy rawness bore a hole through the middle of his back. The feeling was so powerful that Arthur spun around, awkwardly reaching behind himself and trying to rub the assaulted area. What was that? It had felt like something was trying to reach into his soul. You felt it, didn't you? Nurse Ackerman was back. Felt what? Arthur asked. You know what. Arthur ignored the nurse and sat down in the vinyl chair. He couldn't look at the man again quite yet, so he looked at Nurse Ackerman. Her uniform pants were too short. He could see her black socks and an inch or so of white skin beneath them, and the hem of her pants. We'd be remiss if we didn't warn you, she said. We? Myself, Nurse Thomas, and Nurse Colton. We've worked in the hospice wing the longest. We know what he... She wrinkled her nose at the word. What that is. And what is it? He, Arthur stammered. Evil, Father Blythe. Evil pure and simple. Arthur shook his head. Just because he looks like that, that's not the evil, Nurse Ackerman cut in. She waved her hand at the revolting mass in the bed. Then what is? It's what's inside of that. Inside? As in, under the bones? In the organs? Nurse Ackerman flicked her hand as if Arthur was asking stupid questions. Who cares? It's in there. She shook her head and sighed. I knew he wouldn't believe me. Opening a file Arthur hadn't even noticed she was holding, she crossed to the X-ray viewer. There she slapped 3 brain scan images into place and pointed. Look. Arthur gingerly stepped around the man's bed as if he might attack him. Nurse Ackerman lifted her chin toward the brain scans. See? There? She pointed at one part of the scan. And there. Arthur leaned forward. He had no idea what he was looking at. I'm sorry, you need to explain. Nurse Ackerman sighed. These are coronal, sagittal, and cross-sectional scans of the man's brain. You can see the same thing in all of them. Arthur couldn't, so he said, You'll need to tell me what we're seeing. She sighed again. Our brains have 4 lobes, the frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. She tapped areas on each of the scans. Unless a brain has a tumor or damage from a trauma like an injury or stroke, signals in each of the 4 lobes should be relatively coherent. Although this man shows no sign of tumors or brain injury, the lobe signals aren't coherent. She tapped the signals again. Arthur focused on the sagittal scan, which showed the man's brain in profile. There he could see what looked like 2 different colors or textures in each area. He pointed at them. Is that what you're talking about? Nurse Ackerman nodded. The doctors believe each lobe of this man's brain has 2 distinct electromagnetic signals. That's unheard of. What does it mean? Arthur asked. Nurse Ackerman made a clucking sound. The doctors claim they don't know, but we know. We? She gave him an eye roll that clearly indicated he was daft. Me and my fellow nurses. What do you think it is? We don't think, we know. What do you know? 2 signals. She jabbed each lobe. Means 2 living things, 2 entities. They're both vying for control of the brain. That's why they're present in all the lobes. But they're at odds with each other. We think they're tormenting each other. Arthur had no idea what to say to that, so he blurted out the first thing that came to his mind. Where's the evil? Nurse Ackerman threw up her hands. Then she waved at the scans. There! How can one brain have competing signals? It's the very playground of evil. Arthur thought maybe Nurse Ackerman should visit a different wing of the hospital. Perhaps the psychiatric wing. But no, that wasn't kind. He should have more empathy for this woman. Anyone who was taking care of this man in this room was entitled to have a crazy theory or two. At least she and the other nurses had a theory. Arthur had nothing. Nothing but his faith. Every man has good in him, Arthur said. That's not a man. Okay, every living creature has good in it. Nurse Ackerman reached out and yanked the scans from the viewing box. I knew you wouldn't listen. Arthur turned and looked at the man in the bed. It's my job to see the good. Nurse Ackerman only shook her head and walked out of the room. Mia pulled a flimsy beige plastic chair out from one of the round tables in the staff break room. The room contained a small fridge, a counter, a microwave, and half a dozen tables with chairs. It smelled like barbecue sauce and spoiled cheese. If Mia hadn't been so hungry, the smells would have ruined her appetite. But she'd worked up an appetite so strong she could have eaten her lunch in a sewage treatment plant. Mia opened her bag lunch and pulled out the turkey sandwich her boyfriend had made her that morning. He was so sweet. She set up her paperback thriller in front of her and popped open a cola. She took a bite of the sandwich and washed it down with cola, noticing the do's and don'ts posters tacked all over the plain white walls. They didn't make her feel welcome, nor did they make her feel any better about her decision to take this job. It was a stepping stone, right? That's what her boyfriend said. Keep your nose clean, do a good job, and you'll be moving up in no time, he said. Mia took another bite of sandwich and chewed appreciatively. That's when her new boss, Nurse Ackerman, and the 2 other bigwig nurses on the hospice wing marched in. Mia immediately dropped her head and pretended to be reading. How long has he been in here? Nurse Thomas asked, plopping into a chair at the table behind Mia. Mia could smell her lavender-heavy perfume. Father Blythe? Nurse Ackerman said. All morning, moron. 2 chairs scraped the floor, and Mia knew the other 2 nurses had sat, too. Nurse Colton was right behind Mia. Already, Mia had noticed several times that Nurse Colton needed a stronger deodorant. Mia had already planned on listening to whatever the nurses said, but when she heard Father Blythe's name combined with moron, she tuned in more closely. Father Blythe was the very nice priest who had walked her up here to start her new job. He'd been so kind and patient with her. He was cute, too. Not in a boyfriend kind of way, but in an adorable man kind of way. Short and slight, with thick wavy gray hair and gentle brown eyes, Father Blythe looked like the grandfather Mia wished she had. She liked him immediately, and it made her mad to hear someone call him names. Nurse Ackerman was the moron. Mia had learned early on in nursing school that not all nurses were nice. Some were so unpleasant, Mia wondered why they'd gone into nursing in the first place. But Nurse Ackerman was the worst she'd met so far. The woman was just plain icky, never smiling, stalking around, firing orders. Nurse Ackerman showed immediately that Mia wasn't going to get anything from her new boss except for criticism and judgment. And what was it with using last names? "We use surnames on this wing, Nurse Vermont," Nurse Ackerman said, when Mia had introduced herself with a friendly, "I'm Mia." Fine, Mia didn't want to be friends anyway. And then there was Nurse Thomas. She was nice enough, but there wasn't much there. Mia wondered how Nurse Thomas managed to keep her job. Round and sweet-looking, with curly graying black hair, Nurse Thomas looked like she should be at home baking cookies. She called everyone sweetie, and she loved to pat people on the back, but she wouldn't remember to bring her feet along if they weren't attached at the ankles. Already that morning, Mia had spent what seemed like half her shift finding things that Nurse Thomas had lost. Nurse Colton was the only reasonably normal nurse Mia had met so far. In her mid-40s, Mia guessed, Nurse Colton was an athletic-looking woman with brown hair chopped short in a boyish cut, and a great tan. She was nice enough, Mia supposed, but she was too serious, as if she had something heavy on her mind. Mia picked up her sandwich to take another bite. "What did you tell him?" Nurse Colton asked Nurse Ackerman. "What we know. I told him there's evil inside the man." Mia held the sandwich in front of her face. "Evil?" "He refuses to see it, of course," Nurse Ackerman said dismissively. "Well, we know better, don't we, sweeties?" Nurse Thomas said. "I can barely think about it without being scared, and I want to throw up." "Yes, we know better," Nurse Colton said. Nurse Ackerman got up and plucked a plastic bag of carrots from the fridge. No wonder she's so skinny, Mia thought. "He's idealistic," Nurse Ackerman said. "I am too," Nurse Thomas said. "But when the writing's on the wall, it's on the wall." Mia took a bite of her sandwich and willed herself to be invisible. "He's new," Nurse Colton said. "He'll catch on." "I'm not so sure," Nurse Ackerman said. "He's determined." "Time will tell," Nurse Thomas said. "It always does." The nurses chatted for a few more minutes about some of the patients Mia had already met. She wondered about the man with evil inside. Was he a patient? He must be if Father Blythe was here visiting him. Or maybe Father Blythe was visiting someone else. Mia listened, but she never heard another word about the priest. Did she need to find him and warn him? But warn him about what? It sounded like he'd already been warned and didn't believe the warning. Arthur had been sitting in the vinyl visiting chair for over 3 hours. During that time, he'd accomplished little, except that he could now look at the man in the bed without nearly losing his breakfast. This made him feel slightly better about himself, but the self-congratulation was unearned. Arthur knew his belly was empty now, too, so he had no breakfast to lose. And he had no business being pleased, either. He hadn't yet been able to approach the man's bed. He was still completely repulsed, not just by the man, but by the bloody sheets he lay on, and whatever it was that was leaking from the tubes that snaked out from underneath him, attached to heaven knew where. Those tubes curled off the bed, and ran into bags hanging from the bed's frame. Arthur could hear the body waste dribbling into plastic bags that were, regrettably, see-through. Arthur didn't venture a look. Ever since Nurse Ackerman had left, Arthur hadn't said one word out loud. All he'd done was stare and pray. Now he decided he had to do something else. What if the man wanted to communicate? Arthur had no idea how or even whether it was possible, but he had to give the man a chance. Sitting in this chair, 5 feet from the bed, was not giving the man a chance. Arthur took a deep breath and scooted the chair a foot closer. "Yes, that's very brave," Arthur muttered to himself. He chuckled. One of the monitors let out an unusual beep, or rather a normal beep at an unexpected time. In 3 hours, Arthur had learned the monitor's rhythm, and just now that rhythm had varied. Was it because he talked? Breathing shallowly through his mouth, because the closer he got to the man, the worse the smells were, Arthur dragged the chair nearer to the bed. It made a screeching sound on the floor, but the monitors didn't react to that. Arthur got the chair to within a foot of the bed, just outside the distance he thought the man could reach. He knew it wasn't friendly or caring, but Arthur wasn't ready to risk touching or being touched by the man yet. In the 3 hours he'd sat there, he realized a part of him, a truly traitorous part of him, half believed what Nurse Ackerman had said. Was something evil keeping the man alive? Just thinking that disturbed him greatly. How could he be a priest and believe that evil had more power over the body than good? What if something good was keeping the man alive? Wasn't that more believable? Of course it was, he told himself. It was divine energy that created worlds. Couldn't that energy sustain life beyond the time when life was viable? Certainly it could. Although Arthur's logical side argued divine energy wasn't the only kind of energy in the world. "Stop it," Arthur admonished himself, and the monitors beeped out of rhythm again. "You can hear me?" Arthur asked, scooching the chair closer to the bed in spite of himself. The monitor's beep stuttered. The man in the bed didn't move. Arthur leaned forward. "My name's Father Blythe. No, forget that. My name is Arthur. Is there anything I can do for you? I want to help." The monitors beeped erratically for a few seconds. Arthur said a silent prayer, asking for strength. "Divest me of habitual notions of what is and isn't good, what is and isn't possible. Let me see past what my senses are telling me. Give me the strength to see this man as the love I know he is, and help me interact with him accordingly." Arthur sat still and took several slow breaths before reaching out and taking the man's scorched finger bones in his hand. It required every ounce of his heart not to recoil at the dry, crispy phalanges in his hand. He felt like he was holding hands with a tree branch that had just come through a forest fire. No, that wasn't true. It was far worse than that, by far. Because, in addition to the knobby, hard objects in his hand, he could feel the pulsing slither of the man's veins beneath the parched skin covering. "Give me strength," Arthur prayed again. He must have gotten it. That was the only explanation for why he didn't scream when the finger bones and veins he held moved. He did, however, drop the hand. He was human, after all. Was it because he was polite, or because he was afraid of whatever entity had moved the fingers? Entity? What was he thinking? This wasn't an entity. This was a man in hideous circumstances. This wasn't a foe to be vanquished. He was a human being, worthy of love. "You are loved," Arthur said. He could feel the truth of his words. Couldn't he? Actually, he wasn't sure. He usually felt a flush of warmth and a surge of lightness when he said those words, but now? Nothing. The man, however, felt something. He must have, because he began moving his index finger. At first, Arthur thought the finger motions were random, reflexes caused by nerves firing indiscriminately, but then he realized the finger motion was purposeful. "Could you do that again?" he asked. He didn't let himself wonder how the man could hear him. The man had no ears, and Arthur didn't want to look into the tortured tissue at the side of his skull, to see if his eardrums or whatever else made it possible to translate vibration into sound were still intact. Apparently, the man could hear him, because the finger repeated the motion. Arthur watched closely. "It's an F," he said excitedly, when he realized the finger had just written that letter in the air. The finger stopped. Arthur took that to be an affirmation. "Just a second." Arthur dug in his satchel and pulled out a small pad of paper and a pencil. Opening the pad, he wrote F. "Okay, I'm ready." Would the finger move again? Yes. This time it traced an A in the air. "What in the name of all that's good and holy are you doing?" Nurse Ackerman yelled from the doorway. Arthur fumbled with the pencil, and it fell from his fingers. When he bent over to pick it up, he bumped his head on the bed frame. He also inhaled the odor of whatever fluid was draining from the man on the bed. It smelled like a cross between bile and vomit, and Arthur's gag reflex activated. He stood and backed away from the bed, facing the nurse, trying not to vomit. "He's communicating," Arthur announced. Nurse Ackerman strode into the room. "I can see that," she said. "And what makes you think that's a good idea?" "Well, it's a breakthrough. It's progress. Progress is always good." "If you think that, you're dumber than you look." Arthur chose to ignore her. "Do you even know what he's communicating?" Nurse Ackerman said. "For all you know, he could be hexing you." Hexing him? Arthur kept his face blank. But Nurse Ackerman had a point. What was the man trying to communicate? Would it ever be clear? "Well, let's find out," Arthur said. "We should have called a different priest," Nurse Ackerman snapped. "Just ignore her," Arthur said to the man in the bed. He sat back down and repositioned the pencil over the pad. "Give me the next letter." The finger moved again. Nurse Ackerman gasped and began murmuring under her breath. Arthur wrote down Z. "Faz?" "Okay," he said. "Let's keep it going." Arthur had written down FAZBENTERDI by the time Nurse Ackerman returned to the room. Fazbenter D.I. This time, when she returned, she wasn't alone. She had two other nurses with her. Both in the same dark blue uniform, the other nurses also wore similar open-mouthed, wide-eyed expressions. They were obviously appalled by what the man was doing. One of the nurses, a round, grandmotherly-looking woman, covered her mouth with her hand. The other nurse, a tanned woman who looked like she spent the weekends mountain climbing, put her hands on her hips and glared at Arthur. He hoped she wasn't going to get aggressive with him because she could take him without breaking a sweat. They didn't say anything, though, so Arthur kept going. One letter at a time, the man spelled out his communication in the air. When he was done, Arthur had a string of incomprehensible letters on his pad. Fazbenter Dissenter? Fazbenterdiscenter. What did that mean? Arthur frowned at the letters, inserting slashes between various sets. He tried several combinations. Fazbenterdiscenter? Fazbenter Dissenter. Fazbenter Dissenter. Fazb enter Dissenter. I think I have the center right, he mumbled to himself. But the other parts? He tapped his pencil on the pad. Wait, what if he'd missed letters? It had been hard to interpret the motions of the bony fingers. Okay, so what if... Arthur played with the letters some more, landing finally on Fazb enter Dissenter. Arthur thought back over Dissenter. He'd seen that abbreviation before with some of the charities he worked with. Distribution center? Arthur shouted. It had to be. But what was Fazb enter? I need a phone book. He told the nurses, who remained at the foot of the bed, watching Arthur as if he was a live reality show. I need to look up Fazb enter. Fazbear Entertainment, the grandmotherly nurse whispered. What? Arthur asked. Quiet, Nurse Thomas, Nurse Ackerman hissed. Nurse Thomas covered her mouth with a plump hand, but it was too late. Arthur processed what she'd said. Fazbear Entertainment Distribution Center, Arthur cried out in glee. This is amazing! He turned to look at the nurses. They were all pale, even the tanned one, and they all stared at him and the man in the bed with obvious dread. This is remarkable, Arthur said. Has he ever done anything like this before? Certainly not, Nurse Ackerman shook her head. You don't understand the forces you're playing with. Forces? Arthur decided he'd had enough of the nurses. He turned back to the man. Let's see, how can you tell me what this place means to you? Arthur thought for a second. He considered asking the man to air write what he had just given Arthur the name of this place, but that could take hours, and Arthur figured the man didn't have the strength for that. Given that he should have been dead long ago, lengthy communications didn't seem like a good idea. Plus, as excited as he was, Arthur really needed to leave this room. It seemed to him like the sulfur smell was getting stronger, and now there was a hint of feces odor wafting from the bed. Did the man's bowels work? Arthur hadn't wondered before, and he wasn't going to look now. I have an idea, he said, relieved that he did, indeed, have an idea. And that's where we're going to end it for now. Wow, okay, the plot thickens. Very interesting. Just a quick note, this is a longer story, so instead of 2 parts, I'm going to split this one into 3 parts. Also, that's also kind of because of the Stitch Wraith story at the very end. I just think it would be better for me. I could get these parts out quicker. But I'm really excited to continue. So, very interesting story. I'm assuming this story is going to have something to do with the Stitch Wraith. Possibly Andrew from there. I don't know. I'm really confused. I have no idea, really. Thank you guys for listening. Make sure to let me know what you think in the comments below, because I do read them. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.